Hello, good afternoon or good evening. I'm Ellen Remmer, and I am delighted and humbled by the chance to moderate this session on applying a racial equity lens to global impact investing. While we're getting going here, we'd love it if you could take the very simple poll that should be inserted in the chat on the right side of your screen, and we'll return to that later. So, like many of you, I wear a few hats. I'm senior partner at the Philanthropic Initiative, where I've been for over 25 years. And also co-founder of Invest for Better, a nonprofit focused on mobilizing millions of women here and abroad to recognize and embrace the power of their investments to shape a more just and sustainable future. I became an advocate for values-aligned and impact investing more than a dozen years ago, as I increasingly realized that philanthropy, while critically important, is simply not enough if we're going to make a dent in the world's most pressing issues. That we have to use the power of the markets, and indeed we need to make fundamental changes in how the markets work, who has access to the markets, and which worldviews and values will shape it going forward. I deeply believe that we need to bring the voices and assets of women and BIPOC populations into this power equation. We've made a lot of progress in the last few years in growing the values-aligned and impact investing markets, and even bringing them into the mainstream. But we are very early too, and the markets are still incredibly imperfect and immature when it comes to applying any number of values lenses, be it environmental sustainability, gender equality, human rights, or racial justice. The absence of data, agreed upon metrics, and accountability are huge challenges. Entrenched practices and power dynamics are even bigger. This is a massive work in progress, and we all need to play a role in making sure it doesn't go off the rails. There's been rapidly growing interest in bringing a racial justice equity lens to the investing market since the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others came to the fore in 2020, particularly in the North American context. Our expert for this session, Rachel Robasciotti, has been a leading spokesperson and practitioner in bringing a deeper understanding of how to incorporate a racial equity lens into the investing process, and has developed a really exciting set of strategies, indexes, and funds that are revolutionizing and shaping the field. Rachel is a superstar. She describes herself on her website as a queer Black woman who grew up poor by a single mother. And then I'll add, but she then managed to found her own advisory business, Robasciotti and Phillipson, at the age of 24. At 28, she launched the firm's social justice investing strategy, which would become Adasina Social Capital. Among many other leadership roles she plays, she is treasurer of the board of directors for Resource Generation and a board member for One Fair Wage. So, because Rachel is the expert and I am not, we're going to run this session in a Q&A interview style. I'll be asking some questions during the more prepared part of the session, but we really want you to ask questions too throughout. And during the Q&A time at the end. We also know that you have a lot of wisdom to share. You have a lot of different experiences to share. And we want to be responsive to what you came here to learn. So get that chat box ready. We really want to lift all of that up throughout our session. So if you could pull up the first slide. This is really what we're going to be discussing today. We're going to have very few slides. They're going to be two basic questions that we're going to structure our interview around, although who knows, may go in different directions. But what we're prepared to talk about is how does one find racial equity investment solutions with meaningful impact? So that'll be the first set of questions around that. And then how to implement racial equity, how to implement it in an investment portfolio. So now I want to turn to Rachel, who I think is who you've all come to listen to. And let me just see, is the poll back yet? No, okay. So Rachel, so the first question, how to find racial equity investment solutions with meaningful impact. Maybe we should start with, you suggest we start with the issues of who helps us. Who do we hire to manage investments? Or who do we partner with? Who do we go to help bring a racial equity lens to that choice? And is that changing from the way it used to be?
Well, Ellen, I just want to start by saying how happy I am to be here in this conversation with this particular group. I have to be really honest and say that there's been a tremendous amount of interest around this topic inside of philanthropy, and at times it feels like even more so than in the traditional investment world. So while I know philanthropy is always pushing itself forward, and there are folks like the ones in this room who are at the cutting edge of moving philanthropy forward, I just have to say that the investment industry as a whole has quite a lot to learn from the work that's already been done with you folks. So I do really want to start with this question of who we hire, because most people hire professional asset managers. And when they're thinking about racial equity, even though they may have personal or organizational values around racial equity, that may end up getting lost by the time they work with the professional gatekeeper, usually that helps them make investment decisions. So I just want to talk for a moment about why it matters who we hire, and then get to some more specifics about how to go about hiring in a more racially equitable way. And for those of you who are do-it-yourselfers in this conversation, don't worry, even if you're making these decisions yourself, we'll get to some of those issues, like how you can apply racial equity, even if you're managing your own investments as well. But I think that talking about who we hire matters because most assets are professionally managed. So hopefully we can put into the chat the first installation in our series from Race and Finance, which we started to publish after the death of George Floyd last year, when so much of what we heard from finance generally was, oh, finance doesn't really have anything to do with this. And we said, oh, wait a minute, let's give some education here about kind of the history and responsibility that finance has when it comes to issues of racial equity and racial justice. So the reason why this matters is because the vast majority of wealth in the world is concentrated in the United States and Europe. And most of that wealth was originally generated by the theft of land from the indigenous populations here in the United States and the establishment of the transatlantic slave trade. And while much European wealth was generated as the result of the transatlantic slave trade, and other colonization, I think often when we are considering racial issues of racial justice in a global context, we don't really speak about the fact that while the transatlantic slave trade was enslaving people in the United States, the benefits were actually global and disproportionately in Europe and the United States. And what's relevant about this is that the investment industry was quite specifically the distribution and management system for capital that really allowed slavery to even function as an economic model. And that's important because most people don't understand specifically that what I mean by that is that Wall Street itself in the United States, in New York, was built by enslaved people, and it became the home to the official slave market for New York. And that the first American bond market, which fueled the creation of wealth throughout the world, the first American bond market started with enslaved people as collateral for lending. And all of this was being done on land that was fully populated by an indigenous American population, kind of like before the first settler colonists arrived. So the fact that US and European wealth has this deep tie to the theft of land and labor from Black and indigenous individuals, so different racial groups, I think that it raises a really important question for people in philanthropy. And one of the more useful questions that I've seen addressed where this concerned is, what is the foundation for your foundation's assets? So what I mean by that kind of play on words is, where did the money come from? Not just the proximate money, like maybe your foundation's money came from someone whose company began to be traded publicly, but where did that intergenerational wealth come from? And we're not ready to go to the investment roles slide yet, so I'm fine to just take down slides for now if we just want to have Ellen and I up. And we can bring the slides back up in the moment. And one hint that I would give you all in the audience is look at the geographic history of where you're located. What was the basis for wealth that was generated? if that person who took a company public came from family wealth, where was that family wealth from? Invariably, the theft of land and labor from Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities tends to show up in these histories. And so I share all of this to really speak directly to the idea that we have a unique responsibility, both in the philanthropic sector and then also in the investment sector, which, as I said before, was the management and distribution system that even let slavery continue to exist for as long as it did, for hundreds of years. So how does that context impact who we hire? I have a deep belief that racial equity in who we hire to manage our investments is actually an important way of creating a more equitable future through the repair of past harms. And that's, generally speaking, kind of the definition of justice. It's the creation of the future through the repair of past harms. So if we hold a responsibility in finance, in philanthropy, primarily where assets were generated in the US and Europe, then how do we go about repairing and bringing about justice in the choices that we make? So that's one of the reasons why who we might hire matters, and we can talk about where the state of things are momentarily. But I also want to bring into the conversation this idea that racial equity in investing, aside from having responsibility for where the assets came from, it actually matters just for fulfilling your fiduciary responsibility to the assets of your organization. If more than half of the world's population are people of color and women, and they are decidedly far more than half of the world's population, but 99% of asset management or investment management is owned by white and male people, then there's something going on. There's a major skew in who manages the assets. And are there perspectives that are being left out of the portfolio? And are you, as a result, not meeting your fiduciary obligation by not moving toward racial equity within portfolios? But we'd love to hear from the participants about this as well. So anything that can come into anyone that wants to add into the chat, and Ellen, I'll take it back to you just to field some questions from folks. We'd love to hear from you all, just at looking at like this question of why this matters.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Rachel. That was a great start on the conversation. And again, if production could take the slide down, that would be great. So I know, being very involved also in gender lens investing, there's been a lot of interest in investing in women managers and women enterprises, and I'm hearing the same conversation happening at the racial equity area. But it feels like progress is just moving at a snail's pace. So maybe you can talk a little bit about why are we making such slow progress on this? What are the barriers?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, of course, we're still open to hearing from you all any questions or reflections on what's been shared already. So please continue to have those come in via the chat, and we'll circle back to those. But more specifically, just to give folks a sense of where we are, I kind of already started to hint at this. So let's go ahead and bring up the next slide that is about kind of the state of things in asset management. And so I want to just start by explaining investment roles more generally. So I made this statement about 99% of asset management being owned by white male individuals. So if you look at these different roles, this is the place where even if you're a do-it-yourselfer, just kind of knowing what these roles are and their impact can have a pretty large, can have a pretty big enlightening effect here and impact on how you're making decisions. Generally speaking, asset owners are the individuals or organizations, and in this case, it would be those in the philanthropic sector who have assets to invest. Asset allocators are the financial professionals who make investment decisions on behalf of the asset owners. So these are your investment consultants. These are financial advisors. They sometimes go by wealth manager, And what these allocators do is they engage in a process of evaluation that has a very specific name in the investment industry. And the name of that process is due diligence. and they are performing this evaluation process or performing due diligence on asset managers. These folks sometimes go by the name portfolio manager, money manager, and these are firms or financial professionals who compile portfolios or collections of investments to meet very specific financial or impact goals. So in most cases, even if you're kind of a do-it-yourselfer, you have someone that owns the assets, so the asset owner, you have someone who allocates the assets to investment managers, that's the asset allocator, and then you have the asset managers themselves. I want to focus for a moment just on asset managers and the important role that they play. Allocators are serving the asset owner. They aren't actually often very specifically choosing investments directly. However, if you're a do-it-yourselfer, you may be the asset owner and the asset allocator. You may be allocating your own assets. And so you actually are choosing the investments yourself. And if you carry these values around racial equity, you're going to get some more information in a moment about, like, very specifically how to find those particular either asset managers or investments. But the reason why we focus on the asset managers is because most people aren't do-it-yourself folks, and most allocators need to hire asset managers. Now, what's really funny about hiring an asset manager is that it can happen in a variety of ways. You can hire someone to manage the investments in an account. You can hire someone to go out and find you deals. You can just buy a mutual fund or exchange traded fund. That's hiring an asset manager too. You're hiring the firm that put it together. The asset managers have the closest connection to the direct impact that you want to make. And so as a result, who manages these assets and the asset, like who the asset managers are, matters, because BIPOC asset managers, women asset managers are overwhelmingly more likely to include issues of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the decisions that they make to begin with. And choosing to hire them is an act of racial, and as we've been talking about, gender equity in and of itself. So what gets in the way is this, and I think that we're on another screen, but we can go ahead and go back to the screen with the slide on it. So what gets in the way here is this very large due diligence evaluation process. What happens here is that there are barriers, and you may have heard of some of these before, and the barriers sound like this. Okay, well, we aren't even going to consider you as an asset manager unless you have X million. It's very common for it to be 200 million, 100 million in assets that you're already managing. Or we aren't going to talk to you unless the investment strategy has already been proven out over a 3-year track record. These are very specific issues that stand in the way of any new entrants coming into the asset management realm. This is important because while a lot of us care about these issues of equity, justice, equity, diversity, inclusivity, when it comes right down to it, we have these gatekeepers, or we ourselves are using due diligence processes that systematically exclude anyone but existing players. Now that becomes a problem when 99.1% of all asset management firms are owned by white men. So just to give you a sense of like where the state of things are, that's pretty much been an unchanged number over the last 10 years. So as the owner of an asset management firm myself, when we can start to talk about some of the solutions here, and going to the next slide, what ends up happening is that we kind of get caught in a due diligence process that never allows any new entrants into the field. And so at present, if you don't look at majority ownership, if you just look at who owns 25% or more of an asset management firm, so we aren't even talking about majority ownership. Women and people of color, as you can see there, make up 1.3%, and white men make up 98.7%. If you take those numbers up to like, well, who's the majority owner? You get 99.1% and 0.9% are owned by women and people of color. So I just want to start to talk about some potential solutions here. So if we can go to the animation on this slide. Click. One good time. One of the solutions that that we came up with in a coalition of asset managers asset allocators and some very progressive asset owners, including some foundations you may be aware of and see on this list as signers, was something called the Due Diligence 2.0 commitment. And that commitment has a series of 9 different steps that those who are allocating assets, whether you're doing it yourself or hiring someone, steps that they can take to ensure that their due diligence process continues to meet the fiduciary obligations that the asset allocator has and that the asset owner has to the assets, while at the same time not creating these systemic barriers. So it's actually, if you go to duediligencecommitment.com, it is it's a set of 9 different principles. Probably the most important I've summarized here. One is to reassess assets under management as a risk metric. Like, one of the reasons they say you need 200 million in assets under management before you can be hired is because that's a very rough estimation of the risk that's involved. If you're concerned about the investment manager going under, and they don't have, at least 200 million, for example, in assets under management, then you're basically saying that that's the metric for risk. And if you go to this commitment, you can actually see, why don't you think a little deeper? What's truly the risk, for example, with a public markets asset manager? If you buy a mutual fund or an exchange traded fund that's run by a BIPOC asset manager that has less assets under management, what's the true risk there? Won't those funds won't the securities within that fund just be distributed back to the owners pro rata if the company that's managing it goes under? So it asks us to take a deeper look at assets under management as your risk metric and potentially adjusting that. Also, to consider track record alternatives is a big one. If you say everyone has to have 3 years of a track record, and you aren't willing to use anything but a traditional track record, then again, you're going to go back to the same pool of 99.1% majority white male owned firms, and that's where you're going to be drawing from. So often BIPOC owned firms won't necessarily have the very specific 3-year track record and these many different opportunities to leverage on the wins they've already had to launch new funds or new products. Usually, since they're coming from not a lot of family wealth and not a lot of institutional privilege, they may be able to offer you something that gives you a sense of how the investment will perform without them needing to meet a strict track record requirement that will automatically disqualify them from due diligence processes. And then there are many others to consider there, but I would just highly recommend that as much as possible that asset owners and their allocators, most importantly, offer transparency about what hurdles there are. If you know you aren't going to consider someone with less than 100 million in assets under management, and you know that you need at least a 3-year track record, be very honest and upfront with the asset manager that you're working with about that, so they can decide whether or not to spend their time engaging in the due diligence process itself. So those are some kind of quick ideas about how we can start to address this from the asset management slide. And I hope that we can put in the chat a link to the Due Diligence 2.0 commitment if we haven't already. But I'd like to just take a step back for a moment and bring Ellen back up on the screen to talk about some of our poll results, see where folks are in the audience. It looks like maybe we've even posted some here in the chat.
And Rachel, I'd love to, so in terms of what this group can do, it sounds like looking at the Due Diligence 2.0, considering becoming a signatory. I'm assuming that group regularly gets together, and is there any more you can add in terms of specific action steps, whether they could ask questions about it?
Even more important than being a signatory, if you're an asset owner, and I think that's mostly who's here with us today, even more important is that you take this commitment to the gatekeeper, to the asset allocator, because that is actually the bottleneck. That there's been overwhelming interest from the asset owners who want to move in this direction, and we keep falling out of due diligence processes. And so take a look at the Due Diligence 2.0 commitment, consider signing it yourself, take it to the asset allocator, make the asset allocator using these the principles in these commitment, make those kind of a way of evaluating whether or not you want to keep working with that particular asset allocator. Also, there's a list of signers, of asset allocators that signed this, and those are going to be the ones that you can hold accountable. Just because you sign this doesn't necessarily mean you're all the way where you should be. It just means that you made an open and public commitment that you're willing to have folks be in conversations with you about it. It starts to create a certain amount of transparency and a basis for a conversation. I know that some of our early asset owners signed, and then certain asset managers in our community had conversations with their allocators, and were able to go back to the asset owner and say, like, hey, you all signed this, but because your allocator didn't, they kind of kicked us out of the process for not having the 3-year track record, even though we had something substantially equivalent that they could use. So it really just starts to form the basis for conversations and relationships. And I know this is something that Philanthropy and this group has been working on for a long time. How do we begin to move ourselves into right relationship around grant making? And this is a tool that enables this conversation and moving into right relationship between asset owners, asset allocators, and asset managers.
Great.
Yeah, so I think that that's kind of very specifically one of the things that can be done here.
Well, and it just speaks to this issue. I mean, the asset owners really, we can do a lot. Sometimes we feel like we're so removed from it, but by asking these questions, being aware of these things, this actually brings me to the poll. It looks like the group is kind of on average at around 5 on a scale of 1 to 10. How far along are you in incorporating a racial justice lens in your investing? So we've got, a few people. Some people are in the early stages. We've got some people. Nobody ranked themselves 10, but we had some people rank themselves 8. So we should see some sharing of things that you are doing, because I think that's really important, because there's a lot going on. You all may come at it from different perspectives. So again, don't be shy about sharing any of that with the group here. It's frustrating because we can't quite see each other and talk, but so we have to rely on chat.
But you know what I really love about a lot of people here ranking themselves as 5. So and please put into the chat if this is not true. Where I take that to be is that, like, hey, as an organization, we're really bought into this. We care about this. We've done the work as much as possible to get everyone in the organization on board, but we haven't yet been able to figure out how to implement it. And I just want to give you a lot of encouragement. The Due Diligence 2.0 commitment is directly about implementation and directly about removing systemic barriers to changing who manages the money and therefore what you ultimately are invested in. And you can use it yourself if you're self-allocating, or you can hold your asset allocator responsible to changing their practices. We had a few asset allocators we talked to about this. By the way, this has been through a multi-billion-dollar asset allocators investment committee before we ever went public, just to make sure, could an asset allocator who's multi-billion-dollar actually agree to these things? And they were one of the first signers. And one of the things that we came to understand about that process is that this is the gummed up system that continues to allow racial injustice to persist. And so there have been multiple conversations with allocators. Actually, honestly, every allocator that signed, there's been at least one conversation where it's like, oh, wait a minute. This means we're going to have to change our due diligence system. And this has been kind of a sacred system that allocators do not generally tend to change. And I'm like, yes, if we want systemic change, we have to change our systems. And that is hard work. And this is a step-by-step process to do that.
We were just hearing in the keynote before this, it's systemic change, absolutely. So let's talk about the what, and about the frameworks you use or you recommend others use, a framework or approach to guide what we invest in that truly supports racial equity, which might look different in the US, globally, or in other regions. So what does it look like in the US? What does it look like globally? Love your thoughts.
Absolutely. So I believe that just based on our approach, that the most important thing that we can do is, if we intend to have any particular impact, is to be in a relationship with the communities that we intend to impact. And I think this is something that's come along a bit farther in philanthropy than in the investment world, but we're trying to make that transition as much as possible at Adasina. And so if you take a look at our social justice investment criteria ourselves at Adasina Social Capital, and just for full disclosure, we're a public markets, we do have a global portfolio, but we are primarily in public markets, though we do a lot of work with partners in private markets, and I'll be able to give you some of those examples as well. But if you look at our social justice investment criteria, these are criteria that were created in direct relationship with social justice movements. So these are the national and international organizations with local presence. So they can't purely be like national and international organizations. These are those that also have a local presence, that are led by and operate on behalf of the most impacted communities. And those communities that we're talking about are those that are the most impacted by issues of racial, gender, economic, and climate injustice. So a guiding principle in this work always is not only like, what are you focusing on, but like kind of who told you that that was how you should focus your investment and your work in this particular area. So when you look at our social justice investment criteria, one of the things you'll notice is that when we are looking at racial equity, we focus quite specifically on decarceration because of its link to historic inequities in the United States and elsewhere. So that's something that rather than focusing too closely on the fact that the issue is decarceration, what I really want to lift up is that the investment world's first response to issues of racial justice was to make all these big corporate statements about, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is wonderful. But if your partners in developing your criteria are the Movement for Black Lives, Color of Change, Race Forward, and these other sorts of organizations, as they are in our case, then what you know is that while diversity, equity, and inclusion is extremely important, it doesn't actually start to address the core issue, which is this issue of mass incarceration and the way communities are policed. That's a direct outcropping in the United States and in other places of the history of that transatlantic slave trade. And so while we're focusing on decarceration, kind of specifically, what's even more important is that, let's say that issue were to be dealt with entirely, and that was no longer a major focus of ours, we would be looking for the next focus directly from the communities that are the most impacted. And like I said, this may seem a bit more familiar in philanthropy because I think you all have been working on it a lot longer than we have, but it's a new concept inside of investment management. And we can talk in a moment what this looks like a bit more globally if you want, but I'd love to hear from other folks in the audience, if it's possible, to kind of share in the chat about what are some of the issues that feel relevant to you in terms of like what the most impacted communities are asking for when it comes to racial equity. I'm wondering if people have contact with that. And then just wondering if anything's coming in. I know we have kind of a quiet audience. Okay.
Yeah. I haven't seen anything yet come in. So again, want to encourage folks. So please write in the chat what you're doing. And I think your point, Rachel, about it's very interesting. Your very radically different way of listening to the community and listening to social movements, which of course, yes, has been much earlier embedded in philanthropy, had been a conversation for a while, but that's such a radically different idea in investments that it's a big systemic change.
It really is. Investments we really think we know already and don't need to ask anyone outside of finance. And so it's funny because I think radical humility is a big piece of what drives our approach, is a sense that actually we don't know, but we do know who to ask.
Yeah. And becomes complex, but it's complex too when you're looking in a global environment as well, because you've got so many different regions of the world. So I don't know if you're ready to sort of talk about at the global.
Yeah. And I see a few questions that are coming in. So let me touch on what's coming up globally around issues of racial equity, kind of like what the next frontier is, where that's concerned. There is, at the intersection of racial and climate justice, is this, and you'll see this coming up a bit later too when I kind of talk about specific examples, is this issue of agroecology and extractive agriculture. So of course, we need to be looking at fossil fuels they're the first place. But if we're looking for like beyond step one in our portfolios, if we're looking more globally, when we asked those who were most impacted at the intersection of racial and climate justice, we heard an overwhelming response that people of color in the global South were the folks who were disproportionately impacted by climate change, and also by the practices of those in the industrial agriculture sector that were being more extractive of land and human resources. So, so again, it's interesting because racial equity and climate don't necessarily come together as often, but one of the things that we're doing at Adasina, part of our work is organizing other investors. And so if you're connected with us, you'll see later in the year, we'll be putting out a list that helps to describe and identify which companies are engaged in extractive agriculture, and to really make the link between those connections around racial and climate justice.
Yeah, interesting. That's very interesting. There's a question in here also about democracy and voting, which I would think applies, again, both in the US and internationally. And how much is that being used as part of the framework for thinking about racial equity?
So while it definitely is an issue that matters, our social justice partners, for example, like in the United States specifically, have asked us to focus primarily on decarceration. They're very clear about what their priorities are. It's not that diversity, equity, and inclusion doesn't matter, and it's not that democracy and voting doesn't matter, but they're like, you people, you get folks to divest from the prison industrial complex and all of the parts that feed into it. Separate from that, there is work that we do along with Majority Action and the SEIU here locally to start to get public companies on our side, it's the public markets, to disclose their participation in political giving to candidates that are seeking to take away voting rights. It's actually become only more difficult to get that information. It's not impossible. And this is kind of the answer to the question about the recent abortion access legislation as well, is that tracking down corporate political spending is very involved, and that's something that that's a particular place that we go to as a metric for reproductive rights, like which companies are giving to the lawmakers that put in place the Texas abortion ban, for example. That's something we were already looking at, is like, how companies are giving politically, which has some other complex issues associated with it, but very particularly if they're taking away voting rights and if they're taking away reproductive rights. That's something to focus on in a social justice portfolio for sure.
Yeah, the issue of finding the data, and you're talking about companies, on U.S. exchanges. I mean, I think in some of the European exchanges, you can get data, but I'm
a bit easier actually. Yeah.
But again, you talk about some of these other parts of the world, and if they're not public companies, of course, getting that information is pretty darn difficult.
It is difficult, but it shouldn't change the fact that you're able to have that, like if you're self-allocating, or if you have an asset manager that is like looking for private investments for your organization, they can ask about political spending. The fact that it hasn't been done doesn't mean that you can't ask the question. Often with a private deal, you have actually a lot more leverage in the due diligence process. Be more engaged as an asset owner. Tell the asset manager, or decide yourself if you're doing it, what kinds of things you want to know about. I mean, we can change that due diligence process. Instead of being one that systematically keeps allocating assets to the largest players, we can actually change that due diligence process to focus on whatever the metrics are that we believe are most important. And I would highly recommend that those be the ones that the impacted communities have told us to focus on.
Yeah, that's really, really a good point. And just developing your framework and being able to use it consistently, whether you're doing a private investment or choosing a public fund. If you're ready, maybe we'll move on to that second area of how to implement racial equity in your portfolio. And if there's one thing I've learned in all my years of advising lots and lots of family foundations, it's a lot of these things are really about around a group dynamic and influence. And we all know that both millennials and women are more interested in this kind of investing than others. And so how do you get, if you're the champion and you're working with others, maybe just a partner or a whole board or a family or investment committee, how do you get them on board? How do you get them aligned with you about the goals here and also developing a process?
Yeah, absolutely. Given the poll results, it seems like the folks that are here are already definitely like well on their way, but it is also important to talk about the ones where it's like, but I still actually need to get the rest of the family or the rest of the board on the train. And I got to tell you, everyone feels very in touch with a fiduciary commitment to the organization. And I mentioned earlier that not having racial equity in the portfolio means that you are systematically excluding a huge portion of the population in your asset management. So it's always useful to lean on the fiduciary responsibility piece. The other thing that I would recommend is that when you're talking to these folks, stay on that fiduciary responsibility piece, especially the investment committee folks. That's really what they're about. And so fiduciary responsibility has been what we've been told over and over again is the reason why you must have the 3-year track record, or why the due diligence kind of standards keep us out of portfolios. But if you can flip that on its head and start to have conversations about, okay, well, if we don't have diversity in the asset management that's actually happening, and like who manages the funds and who's being invested in, what type of market insight are we losing out on if all of the various actors that can influence markets aren't part of the decision making, if it's only a small sliver of the population that's influencing the decision making? I found that with tougher family groups, investment committees, and so forth, honestly, opening up the question and really just saying, here are the demographics of the world, here's the demographics of our asset management pool, and opening the question, like, what don't we know from having such a non-diverse pool, right, of folks? Like, what is it that we don't know that could impact the portfolio long-term? Honestly, opening up questions that they can't answer can often be the most compelling piece for having them move forward, especially when they start to look it up and realize that diverse asset management teams actually outperform. The SEC even has some of that stuff on their website. That can really be helpful. Secondarily, I would say, think about hiring a consultant who knows how to move organizations along in this process, that doesn't just try to jump them from 0 to fully on board. There are a couple of organizations that I would like to lift up. One is the Racial Equity Asset Lab, or they go by the REAL for short. So the Racial Equity Asset Lab, those are great folks that know how to move and have a path outlined for how organizations move along this process. Also, consultants that we really respect. Again, these are both BIPOC-owned organizations working on these issues, and they often work with majority white organizations. This other one is Frontline Solutions. And so these are a couple of people, even if they aren't the specific folks that you work with, check them out because they can give you a sense of what the organizations that are doing this work, what they look like, what they're talking about, who they're owned by, who they're staffed by.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so like get some professional help and start asking questions that poke holes in that fiduciary responsibility argument.
Right. I mean, it's just so entrenched, some of the practices around 30-year returns and all of that. Absolutely.
Whenever they start using the words corpus and fiduciary, just know that they feel defensive. Like, usually when those words come out, it's like, no, we're the experts that know how to keep all of the money safe. And one of the things that I like, just a really human response to that is, did you know the world would look like this? In California, for us, it's really easy to say, did you know that most of the time when we leave the home, we'd have to wear masks either because of an unmanaged global pandemic or a mismanaged global pandemic and the constant wildfires that are happening and putting toxic pollution into the air. Like if you didn't know that 20 years ago and you didn't prep the portfolio for it, then what makes me think that you'll be ready for the next 20 years? I mean, I think it's actually important to start asking those questions. Like, how was our portfolio prepared for this right now? Was it? Or did it contribute to it?
Right. I was struck in today's paper. I live in Boston, and the Globe said Harvard is finally divesting. I mean, they're finally not going to invest in fossil fuels. I was like, whoa, that took a while.
That has been such a long and hard battle. I'm so glad to hear that. That is wonderful.
All right. So, and in terms of, and maybe you really covered this, the resources to find the kinds of consultants and partners to help you do this. I mean, there's obviously the signatories to Due Diligence 2.0 seems like a great resource.
They're a great resource, yes.
Other places that you would recommend?
Our Emerging Manager Monthly is a subscription-based periodical, but they actually have a free database of a diverse asset manager database. So that's a great location as well. Just depending on where you are in your process. If you are on the more modest end of assets and you aren't really trying to hire one of those very large multi-billion-dollar foundation and endowments managers, if you're actually just looking for like a good advisor, there's CHIP professionals, CHIP. I think it's changing how individuals prosper. They're actually just a really good resource for knowing where people of color are located. They're going to be primarily US based. The Emerging Manager Monthly Diverse Asset Manager database is going to have a wider scope. So, and of course, the Due Diligence 2.0 asset allocators, those are ones that are having these conversations and changing their processes. So they're a good place to start as well.
I wonder if there are other countries that do a good job in terms of identifying these as well, or other regions of the world where there are networks.
We seem to really be leading, like I was saying, the Emerging Manager Monthly does a good job more globally. But the United States has had racial justice front and center because of its own responsibility and history, direct history with it. And so I just feel like more of the tools have really emerged here. But the basis for these tools, like kind of how they're evaluating diverse managers, for example, is something that can be taken and applied more internationally and globally as well. I think that the United States has just had the impetus to do some very early pre-thinking. There's also a link I just want to put in the chat, which is like if you're working with like more of a financial advisor type, there are some ways of evaluating financial advisors, no matter where you are. There are some ways of evaluating the person who's giving you advice to see if they're working against systemic racism. So I'd love to have that. Ali maybe has already put that in the chat.
Great.
And I'd love to hear from the participants. If anyone else, I'd love to hear from other folks about resources. I'll be taking notes.
Yes, please. Again, share with others here, because it looks like, again, from the poll, it looks like some of you are, halfway through the journey. So I'm sure you've got some things to share. And again, whether it's around your due diligence on an individual social enterprise that you think really does a great job around racial equity, or something more broadly. So it looks like we've got somebody who posted, more on the racial equity.
There's the Racial Equity Asset Lab on Frontline Solutions.
Okay.
Those are for getting your organizations on board. Extremely helpful about this stuff.
All right. Well, why don't we move on then to the question of kind of what does a good portfolio look like, and what is how do you assess and take a look at your own portfolio, see if you've I remember talking to mine about, can I do an audit? Can I do a racial equity audit of my portfolio? But as you think about what does a good one look like, what are some examples? I think that would be really useful. So people.
Well, I'm happy to share with you what we're doing at Adasina. I have a couple of slides. And what we're doing is not only available simply through working with us. Like what we're doing, we want to share such that it can actually be used in other contexts. So if we can pull up the next slide that's just about our approach generally, I would love to share about that, but I know there's just a little bit of lag on pulling up the slides. You know, I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record here. We are always working with impacted communities to understand what we should be focusing on specifically. But most importantly in our approach, it's intersectional. So we focus on issues of racial, gender, economic, and climate justice. So you really want to be looking at those intersectional issues. And if you go to the next slide, when looking at our process generally, this is something that others in public markets can adopt. It hasn't really been done yet, but this is something that others can absolutely adopt that we talk about widely. So if you're partnering with the right folks, so for us, we have our social justice partners, as I've mentioned before, they can actually help you create your investment criteria. I've actually heard of some folks in philanthropy and foundations actually working directly with their grantees to figure out what their primary criteria should be. And that criteria for investing should influence your screens, like specifically how are you screening companies in or out of your portfolio. Once you figure out like how to measure these particular social justice issues, so specifically, for example, around racial equity, you know, we were working with the Movement for Black Lives, Color Change. They were like, please focus on decarceration. Then we had to define more specifically, okay, what are the elements of decarceration? So you have to come up with ways of measuring. We call those impact metrics. And so in our portfolio, you see we both focus on prison involvement, but also, which is not the same thing. Owning and operating a prison is not the same thing as providing the funding for those prisons to be built, because they require a fair amount of funding. So we have prison funding, prison involvement. We also have the money bail system, which is a feeder into mass incarceration systems. And again, we're sourcing the ways of measuring with those communities to make sure that we're not only focusing on the what, but like specifically how. So we're working directly with those communities. You always have to, it's really lovely to have all the right impact metrics, but you actually have to have a source of data like, okay, how are companies doing on these issues that we might invest in? So you have to match that with data sets, and there aren't always data sets. Often when there aren't, and it's a critical issue, we will develop a data set that we actually put into the world and use to help other investors use that data as well. It's something that's not often done in finance. We tend to be very proprietary about our data. But given that we're an investment and financial activism firm that has a deep social mission, for us, we're like, hey, if we didn't have the data, neither did anyone else about how to gauge racial equity. I don't have this set up in a link, but on our website at adasina.com, you can find our racial justice impact data set. If you're looking for how public companies score on these issues, we've shared it entirely. So it doesn't give you all 63 different ways of measuring issues of social justice, but you can get most of the racial justice ones there publicly. So data is actually very important. And for us, we build all of that into an index for public equities, and that drives the specific portfolios that we create. So that's how we do it. But these are things like we share our data, and working with those who are most impacted to set your investment criteria and to actually figure out what your metrics are is something that can be done anywhere, even on a smaller scale, even directly with your grantees. I've seen it happen before, and it can be highly impactful. Mm-hmm. So that's one good example. I want to talk a little bit, because I believe that's our last slide on this one, so we can go ahead and take the slides down. I want to talk, people always really want, and I kind of saved this closer to the end on purpose, but people always really want ideas of, you know, what does racial equity look like? Where can I actually find specific private investments? Because those are harder to find than public markets for sure. You know, Adasina has made what we do very easily available in an exchange traded fund. The ticker symbol is JSTC. Short for justice, very easy to remember. But when you get to the private markets, it's a lot more complicated. So I want to give you one really lovely and specific example of something that's coming forward. And then I want to kind of give you a couple of a network to check out. So Jubilee Justice and Pot Liquor Capital are, pardon me?
Great names.
Aren't they? I know, yeah. So Jubilee Justice is a nonprofit organization that is specifically teaching Black farmers in the American South about how to do sustainably grown rice. So it's actually good for the planet and investing into Black farmers retaining their land, which is not such an easy thing to do with the growth of extractive agriculture and large industrial agriculture. Their funding mechanism for this is a combination of grants, but there are also some community development notes that are going to be available by the end of the year. They are not fully set up yet, but they're a really exciting opportunity that is coming into the space because they're really blending racial and economic justice and doing it kind of on this really direct scale. So if you're looking for private investments, I just really want to lift them up. I know the folks that started it, they are just doing amazing work. So I can't send you to a website per se because none of the investment options are really up yet. But what I can do is I can put in the chat, like there's the person that you want to reach out to if what you're interested in is like doing integrated capital, the grant making, and the specific like funding community notes for this work. It's going to be Mark Watson, which I imagine, Ellen, you're very familiar. If you're in Boston, very familiar with Mark's work. The other folks I want to kind of point out are the 22 Fund. Tracy Gray is a Black woman that started a venture fund that's all about supporting primarily people of color to move what they're doing kind of local or nationally on the US side to kind of really develop more internationally their business, the import-export capabilities. And it also has a social mission attached to it. So Tracy Gray and the 22 Fund is another really great opportunity. And then if you're looking beyond those kind of specific opportunities where I know folks are focused on justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and are great investments, which I hope those are wonderful resources for you all. There's also the entire network of VC Include. Mm-hmm. So VC Include, Bahia Robinson, is a place that is specifically supporting funds that are BIPOC. And I know that they're definitely focusing primarily more in the United States, but I do know that they also have a presence outside of the United States and that Bahia specifically worked in Africa quite a bit. And it's just a little bit more complicated to spread the reach out in that direction. But I know that that's on their map for long-term growth as well. And that's a good network for finding folks. By the way, the 22 Fund, for example, is inside of VC Include, one of the VC Include funds. So those are some good options that are out there.
Excellent. Yeah, and somebody mentioned here in a comment, yes, the Food Systems and Racial Equity, the Black Farmer Fund, and the Fair Food Fund are examples, which sounds like what you've been talking about. Exactly.
Gotcha.
Good. There's also a question here about, so, and maybe it's just framing it because I think we've really talked about it. There is, as you're trying to find funds that really fit the racial equity criteria that care about you, there's placing with diverse managers. There's also intersection with some of the themes and looking at some, whether that's agriculture or refugees or climate or something like that. There's also, certainly I know, this whole area of access to capital and providing access to capital to cross wealth inequality that people are mentioning here. So any thoughts about how you find great funds in those areas?
That are specifically about access to capital.
Right. I know there's been, yeah, go ahead.
So much. No, go ahead, please.
No, I know I've certainly seen it, at a place-based level where certainly funds are created that are very specifically aimed at providing access to capital to women and BIPOC enterprise owners and providing all of those supports. And again, I'm assuming this happens in some other countries. I'm seeing it in the US, but I don't know if you are.
So I know specifically one of the a really successful example of this is Backstage Capital, which is Arlen Hamilton's fund that's really not only providing access to capital for BIPOC folks in the United States, but also just providing access to that as an investment opportunity at a lower minimum investment. So that's definitely one where they're literally providing access on both sides. So it's access for the investors, but it's also specifically supporting women and people of color and queer founders. So I know of that in particular. And because I'm not in the private area around access to capital, I know a bit less about the private markets, but I'd love to hear from our audience about what they're familiar with. And Ellen, I know from the Invest for Better network that you all have lots of examples where that's concerned, because I know that's something that the Invest for Better groups definitely focus on, is that access to capital.
Yeah, certainly the Invest for Better groups, one that I've been involved with for a long time, has been looking specifically at trying to provide access to capital, especially for women of color entrepreneurs, and mostly in a place-based way. But I know that there are, there are some very different approaches out there that are not so traditional, like their portfolio funds. They have the Rising America Fund, which is all about providing access to capital to BIPOC women entrepreneurs, or SHIO, which is at an earlier stage even, providing a similar approach. And I think
and they're kind of in between, right? Like they aren't quite public fully because they're about private investments, but they are larger, right? The ones that you're mentioning are larger than just kind of like giving at a more like to the pot liquor capital fund, for example.
Right. And what's exciting about them, and of course this is as we try to create systemic change, there's issues on all sides. And one is that for the typical person to have access to some of these private funds and to invest in them, often the price tag is just so high. And so then again, you've got the same old problem of the same people that, have controlled all the wealth forever, continue to direct all of the capital, because it's hard to start a small fund. It's expensive to start a small fund. So, how do we change the system so that we can be, women and people of color can be the investors as well as the investees?
And I think, and one of the things that we can do is you keep running into, like, if you're deciding where to place seed capital for establishing those types of funds, check out how you're evaluating folks. Does the way that you're evaluating people, if you're one of those, philanthropies that can actually provide that seed capital, does it end up allocating to the people that have already done it and proven themselves? And do they happen to be more white and male rather than women and people of color? So I think it really kind of keeps coming back to, okay, what are the evaluation systems that we're using that maintain these systemic inequities? And also when we're making our investment decisions, who are we talking to? Who's guiding how we're measuring, making impact along the way? And I think if there were two takeaways from this session, those would be the ones that I want to focus on most of all, which is kind of like who is helping us figure out how we're measuring ourselves and what good looks like. Who are we leaning on for making that happen? And how are we evaluating our investments and asset managers in that process? And if we can bring equity to those two pivotal parts of the process, I think we're really going to have tremendously different outcomes, because those are two parts that are specifically about how are you managing the system. So that's how we get to systemic change.
Right. And that we all, literally all of us, have a role to play.
That's true.
Are there other questions or issues that people wanted to discuss today that we haven't had a chance to go through? We'd really love to hear from you if there are any others. And we're not going to quite close yet, but I'm going to be asking you at the end to actually share with us whether there are some specific steps that you want to take as a result of this conversation, as a result of listening to Rachel and just having this talk about where you are now and what could help you go from being a 5 to a 6 to a 7.
Yes,
So-
I love this comment on APIS and heritage. Excellent example. Talk about access to capital. That's a wonderful fund that is specifically, just as another example, putting it out there, is specifically helping Black-owned and majority Black worker companies transition to worker ownership, which is a huge way that we can, share the wealth as we grow. They're a wonderful fund, but if you're interested, get in soon. They only have so much room. And that's something just at Adasina Social Capital, this is something else that I would use to evaluate folks. We have a public commitment to transitioning to worker ownership as well. And I think that that's particularly important for organizations where what they are doing is specifically employing the communities where you want to be redistributing wealth. A really important way of doing that is transitioning to worker ownership. And I have not thought about that previously, but bringing up APIS and heritage is really helpful because I know that that's a way of redistributing wealth. And that's another question that you can add into, your own process for evaluating investments that you would make, kind of like either evaluating companies that you would invest in or funds that you would invest in, is asking that question about like who's employed and is there a plan for worker ownership?
Yeah, I mean, it's in philanthropy. We've been pushing all of ourselves to have more of a theory of change. You've got the end result you're looking for, but what are the pivot points, the leverage points? And it's really the same thing in investments as we're looking at this. I see a question about the factors that have led to a decision for Adasina to include or not include a company in your portfolio.
Well, this is why I have some hidden slides. In our slides, let's look at it. I'm like, this is why I was like, I knew I had one more slide, but I was waiting to see if it was actually something somebody wanted to hear about specifically. I think it's slide number 6, which is Adasina's racial justice investment criteria. If we can hopefully bring that up, it can help to support giving more information about that specifically. And also there is something that I offered, which was our racial justice impact data set that I really want to share with you all. Wonderful. Thanks for bringing that slide up. So, I talked a lot about decarceration, but it goes beyond decarceration also to land rights and self-determination, equity and inclusion, fair dealing. If you these are the broad categories. We start by an orientation towards support for people on the planet. This is what our social justice partners have focused us on. And seeking racial justice specifically, this is kind of a slice of those intersectional areas that we're working on. And so we want to advance certain particular aims, as I mentioned. So beyond decarceration, here are the others. And then we actually have to get down to, okay, how are you screening for that? So one of the things that we added in our most recent update to the, it is a mouthful, to the racial justice impact data set. And I'm going to actually have us share a link to it because it's a free open source for anybody that's interested in how public companies stand on the issues that social justice movements have told us to focus on when it comes to racial justice. You can see where companies stand on the screens that are actually here, and you can check out your own portfolio. So one of the things that happened in our most recent update is that we had prison funding as a criteria for evaluation in our portfolio. And the information that was primarily available to us was like, okay, who are the major investors inside of private prison company stock? And inside of investor organizing movements, there's been a real impact. CoreCivic I think, is one of the private prisons in the United States. And by the way, they also operate, the companies that do private prison work, there are also international companies that do similar work. It's interesting how the business model spreads. We were looking at kind of like who are the major investors in the company stock, but the company stock has actually fallen off of a few indexes for these private prisons by just a result of investor organizing. What we started to look at and really dig deep into the data on when it came to prison funding was like, okay, now that companies are not being buoyed as much by their stock, we really want to take a look at at how they're funding their operation through bonds, because that's also something that isn't incredibly easy to find in the SEC filings, but you can actually find the major bond owners. And so we actually added over 70 companies to basically this kind of exclusion list of public companies that are participating in systemically like racist practices, like mass incarceration. So we actually added 71 companies based on their prison bond ownership. And we reached out, and already we've seen 12 of those companies fall off of the list, basically like they've removed their investment in the bonds. So there's something really important about highlighting where funding for systemically unjust practices is coming from. And so that gives you more of an example. And if you want kind of specific companies and where they stand, as I just added to the chat, the kind of impact data set itself, so that you can kind of just go in for yourself and filter by most of these criteria. One of the things that's really exciting is that if you stay on our email list, this is going to be updated in January with the first, it will be the first public markets Indigenous people screen, and it is an international screen. So it goes well beyond the United States. So if you stay connected with us and join our mailing list, you will get updates about that. And you will also have access to that free data as well when it comes out, because it's really important to be assessing land rights and self-determination based on what the Indigenous peoples themselves are saying matters. And we're working, our social justice partner for developing that data set is First Peoples Worldwide, which is a worldwide organization focusing on those issues. Because that's one of those screens that you see here that if you go to the racial justice impact data set is not there yet, and that's because it's still being worked on, but there's some exciting things happening in January.
Before you move on though, I just want to, really thank you for your field building work. This is what we need more of. And there are plenty of managers and people in the ecosystem who are all jumping on the bandwagon. But we need sort of more, we need the infrastructure, and we need data sets, and we need frameworks, and we need all of that. So it's really important work that you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you for saying that. And I just want to give a big note of thanks. Like, we're bringing many of our multiple public data sets together. We'll be bringing them together in one community led place for social justice impact data. So instead of having, this data set and then another one for forced arbitration for sexual harassment and another one for sub-minimum wages, we'll have them all coming together on one site, so that including the Indigenous people screen, so that people can actually look at all of those issues kind of together. And the Tipping Point Fund for impact investing, since you were talking about kind of the need for infrastructure, they're helping to fund bringing those data sets together and creating a platform where other people too can create these data sets. So it doesn't have to end with us. This is actually a practice and behavior that we can all participate in. Like, if you find that you need certain data and you're willing to, that's something that as values aligned asset owners that you can do. If you find that you want to be screening for something in your portfolio and there isn't data, consider funding getting that data created. And if you have any questions about that, we're happy to talk to you about what we're doing on the nonprofit side of bringing those data sets together, because we're very committed to having free public data about public markets primarily. Yeah, where data doesn't exist.
Excellent. As we're closing up, I realized I'd love to invite you all now to please put in the chat, just to inspire each other and to hold yourself accountable for a next step that you might be taking to get yourself further along the journey. I think it'd be really valuable for other people to see what you're doing and for you to process that yourself. So before we close, I want to start seeing some things appear in the chat.
One step.
You're doing.
The next one. Yeah.
One step. I will say, for me, just some of the notes I've written down about what was helpful to me, the conversation about being in relationship is really, I mean, it sounds so simple, but it's really an important one. And we get so busy with the metrics and the tasks and all of that. And so I'm going to find ways to be in more relationship with my investing, and particularly when I'm putting the racial lens on it. So that's really helpful to me, and also explore the diligence 2.0. So thank you for that, and many of the other resources. And also, in addition to putting down specific steps, if Rachel was saying, really great if you could identify any additional resources you wish you had. So she's been very generous, sharing all kinds of resources. But if there's some other things that you wish existed, that would be fantastic. Expand our advisors that we listen to.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, expand the meaning of advisor. Yeah, maybe you have the financial advisor, but you also have the folks, that are advising on how asset managers are being evaluated in your portfolio.
Well, this is actually really interesting too, because at Investment Better, we've partnered with this new organization, another nonprofit called Values Advisor, which is trying to build out a whole data set of values-based advisors. But one of the things we're working with them on as a next step is, how do you help emerging advisors and emerging managers get on that list, because once again, there are criteria that are around certain assets under management, certain number of years, and how do you highlight those who are diving deep in now and may not, have the 20 years of experience?
Values Advisor is such a great resource. I'm so glad that moved forward and I was able to participate early on. I think they're asking the right questions, So if you aren't part of a network that's using Values Advisor, I know Confluences, I believe Resource Generation will be soon, and multiple other networks. I think that you can encourage whatever network that you're participating in because I think it's by network to really start to use the Values Advisor platform. They're asking some of those better questions about, like, okay, great, like, who do you hire? Who's on staff? What are the issues you're working on? And I think we're getting closer and closer to evaluating our asset managers and our financial advisors based on metrics that actually matter for moving the needle on systemic change. I added our Adasina newsletter sign up in case one of the things you are interested in is staying up to date on the racial justice impact data set that we put out, and knowing when the Indigenous people screen is added. I'll put a link there. That's where you can directly subscribe. And I am just so happy for us to be having these conversations openly and in community. So thank you so much for the opportunity to come together. And it was definitely me doing a lot of talking, and it was more of a quiet group, but I believe that that's mostly because people are taking notes furiously and thinking about all the things that they might want to discuss.
Absolutely. I love it. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much for doing what you do, and for sharing your experience and your expertise, and for being a field builder, and for joining us at this symposium. So thank you so much, and thank you to everybody who was able to join us. And I'll look forward to seeing you in closing plenaries and discussions later on this afternoon. So I think with that, we might as well bring it to a close. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.